Hello and welcome to Chapter 7, and this is Environmental Policy, Making Decisions and Solving Problems. As I stated earlier, this material is a little bit dry, so I'm going to have to ask for your perseverance in pushing through this so that we can get this policy down. I would like to start by taking a look at this picture, and I want to ask you, what do you notice about this picture? For me, I see the girl's hair and I think it looks like she's wearing a wig. But take a look. What do you notice about this? Well, hopefully you're zeroing in on this right behind her. And this is a hydrofracking facility. And if you've never heard of hydrofracking before, what they do is they push sand and water down through a hole that is drilled about 8,000 feet into the surface of the earth, and they crack the shale deposits that help support all of the layers of sediment and soil that has formed on the top. When they crack the shale, it releases gas that seeps up, and they're able to trap and then use that gas for natural gas to heat your homes. So in this chapter, that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at hydrofracking and other means of extracting fossil fuels. We're going to consider the environmental policies and their societal context that allow hydrofracking and practices like this to go on. We're going to look at the role of science in policy making. We're going to find that our economists are putting it all in the hands of scientists to solve the problems, but yet the policies to be able to use or the policies to be able to do hydrofracking that are made by our politicians are getting done despite what science is saying. We're going to look at the major U.S. environmental policies and laws, and we're going to consider and compare them with the international environmental policies and important institutions. And we're going to look at approaches to new environmental policies as well. So the first thing that we're going to look at is, in your book on page 162, is the central case study of hydrofracking at the Marcellus Shale. And this might be something that you are very familiar with because the Marcellus Shale is found here in our own state of Pennsylvania. It encompasses most of the northern and western and central parts of Pennsylvania. It goes into the lower regions of New York. It impacts parts of Ohio and West Virginia. And the companies are actually using this hydraulic fracturing or hydrofracking or fracking that we've talked about, where they inject liquid into the shale, breaking the shale, and then releasing the gas. So the companies think that this is much more efficient and is a way of keeping the prices of the gas low. So I want to take a look at this picture before we finish what we were talking about. And this is what happens when you hydrofrack or fracking. They're going to drill a hole through the mantle. This is going to pass through our soil, pass through our aquifer, and this is where a lot of our fresh water is from. You heard of water tables, and this is where that water is stored. They're going to be forcing sand and water down, and then it'll turn horizontally where that pressure with the sand and the water will crack the shale. This is shale formation. Now keep in mind, this shale is holding up about 6,000 layers of sediment. Now the gas will leak up and out. It will be collected into a pipe and then stored in these tanks. And the excess water, that wastewater, they'll make little pools of wastewater that will eventually, guess what, seep back down into our aquifers. So what this means and why fracking is so widely done in this area is because it means if we use more natural gas, we're using less of our fossil fuels like oil and coal. So they see this as a benefit. There are some people and some groups that claim that hydrofracking is polluting the drinking water, because where else is that water going to go that they have in these storage areas? It's going to seep back down into the ground, into our aquifers where we get our drinking water from. So, environmental policy. When we think of policy, this is a formal set of general plans and principles that help to address the problems and guide decision making for whatever needs to be addressed. When we look at public policy is something that is made by governments. And these policies are actually laws and regulations, their orders, their incentives, and their practices that are put into place to help protect areas. We've talked about an incentive where we talked about paying, we were talking about paying for the land in Costa Rica. Or one of the things we will be looking at is if a company is able to reduce their pollution, they'll get what they call pollution credits that they can use. And sometimes they sell these pollution credits, and that enables them to actually pollute a little bit more because they're staying so close. So these are policies, and the whole idea of these public policies is they're intended to advance societal welfare. So it's supposed to be for our well-being. Environmental policy, this is one that actually pertains to the human interactions with the environment. So how we use that environment, our interdependencies, our interrelationships that go on with them, the coal mining, the drilling for oil, the hydrofracking that we're talking about. And this regulates resource use or reduces pollution to promote human welfare and or protect resources. So that's what environmental policy wants to do. And we're going to see some really shocking things, at least they were shocking for me, where they're cutting off mountaintops for coal, and this is creating flooding and the seepage of toxic chemicals into freshwater systems, and it's causing avalanches into people's backyards. And environmental policy is there to protect that society, that human welfare, but it's not doing a very good job, because guess what? Those areas are where generally poor people live, and we talked about that before in the last chapter. And somehow it seems like they shouldn't be allowed to have the same rights as the wealthy populations should. So that policy needs to be worked on and enforced a little bit better. So science and ethics and economics will help to form policies. Of course, science plays a big role because it provides the factual information, the data, quantitative and qualitative data. It can produce models that can make predictions of continual use. So it provides this information and analysis of that information so that they know what to expect and what could happen. When we take a look at ethics and economics, as we saw in the last chapter, this is just going to clarify how society can address these problems. And again, what type of ethical value are we going to put on these systems? So what happens is the government is going to interact with the citizens, with the organizations, and the private sector to make sure that these policies are in place to protect the welfare of the individual and the resources. So looking at this flow chart, here's science, and science's role is to advance the efficiency and technology and to provide the solutions for environmental problems. And the private sector, the government, the citizens, they believe that science is going to be able to solve all of the problems. Based on what science reveals, the government then puts into policy. And then the private sector and the citizens, they look to the government. They lobby, they campaign, they fund, and they look for legal action. And then the citizens vote. They also lobby and campaign, and they fund for legal action as well. This private sector and the citizens, they can help advance in the efficiency of technology, and they can put their personal actions at it to play by making choices that will help solve the problems. So when we can look at environmental policy, it has to look at it in a fair manner and in a way of sustainable resource use. So when we take a look at environmental policy, we're going to think of this in mixed market economies. So globally, we're looking globally at different ways that governments can intervene. And governments are going to intervene for several reasons. And one, they need to provide social services such as national defense, medical care, and education. So that's one reason why we would see environmental policies being put into place. They also need to provide safety nets for the elderly, the poor, victims of natural disasters, and so on. So that's another reason for policy. They need to eliminate unfair advantages that are held by single buyers or sellers. So sometimes, we get these big construction firms that come in, and it seems like they have the advantages over the people that live locally, and policies are put into place to protect that. They also need to manage publicly held resources. There are resources that are valuable. Your parks, for example, open land is another one. So they need to regulate that. And they need to mitigate pollution and other threats to health and quality of life. So these are why policies would be put into place. We did, and we're going to do an activity in the start of school. It's going to be one of the first things that you're going to do. It's going to be called Tragedy of the Commons. So I want to give you a little bit of a background for that, but we're getting up to 13 minutes in. So I'm going to leave off here for this screencast, and we'll see you on the second screencast to talk about Tragedy of the Commons.